Never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never.
You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.
Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing, for they might not choose socialism.
We cannot afford to be so politically correct anymore.
Conservative One.
With George Christensen.
G'day, I'm George Christensen, host of Conservative One, the podcast defending traditions and freedom. And we've got a new format, obviously, for this edition. It's video, so you get to see me in all the horrifying glory. And also, we're slowly migrating the entire podcast of Conservative One over to a new platform. It is the Good Source. It's got a range of different people on there, including the guest that I'm joined with tonight, who is a great defender of the Christian tradition and freedom in Christ, and that is Lyle Shelton. Lyle, glad that you've joined us for this episode of Conservative One. You've just released a new book which focuses on your very long career from local government councillor through to what you did when you were steering the helm at the Australian Christian lobby. So you've played a significant role, I guess, in Australian politics, not in Parliament, but through the Australian Christian lobby. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your career, particularly as it pertains to politics?
Well, thanks, George. It's great to be on your program, and I love your podcast and that incredibly inspiring intro and everything that you're trying to do through this. Look, you and I go back probably 20 years or more to when we were both local government councillors, you on the Mackay City Council and myself on the Toowoomba City Council. You've gone on to amazing things in the federal parliament. I've been involved as an activist and involved in lobby groups. I have had a career in journalism before all that, worked in a church for a few years as a youth pastor, local council for 6.5 years, and all of these threads have been really important to my life and what I've done, and given me the skills, I suppose, to move on to the next battles: journalism, church work, local government, being a member of the National Party at one stage, standing for pre-selection in a state seat. So, yeah, that's just a little bit of a potted history of my background, and I'm very thankful for all of that because it's helped build upon itself for each new battle that's been ahead.
Now, you've just written the book that I've got in my hot little hands here. I kid you not. Notes from 20 years in the trenches of the culture wars. And you really have been in the trenches. That book, well, I've only got it yesterday, and I've skim read and read the first chapter, an introduction. What I can see there is a history of all of the cultural battles probably over the last 2 decades that we've had in the country, whether it be obviously the same-sex marriage, which I forget that what you described. I think it was the big kahuna of the issues out there, through to abortion, euthanasia, you name it, it's in there because you've been involved in these culture wars. In your role as the head and the public face of the Australian Christian lobby, particularly through the same-sex marriage campaign, you were targeted quite specifically. You talk about some pretty vile Twitter hashtags that were made up about you that were trending and stuff you were subject to. How did that affect you personally, firstly?
Well, George, I feel a bit embarrassed having someone like yourself ask me those questions. And you and I are friends and we go way back, but you know the answer to those questions because you've had all that thrown at yourself and probably even worse than what I have. But you can tell that story one day. I'd have to say most of the stuff, and I don't know if this is what it's like for you, George, but the stuff that the bad guys throw at us, that doesn't worry me because you expect the bad guys to be bad guys. So when a Benjamin Law, favourite of the ABC, gets eat, Lyle, can I say that on your family podcast?
Yeah, you've just said it.
I've just said it and it's live. And I don't normally use that sort of language, but I use it. I use it to highlight a point. They got that trending globally on Twitter after the marriage plebiscite, after we lost, as a way of sort of rubbing our nose in it, literally. But it doesn't worry me. You expect these guys, they don't understand what we understand about the truth and the beauty and the goodness of the things that we are fighting to defend. It's probably more when you get criticism from people on your own side, and I'm sure you've experienced this, George. That's what hurts the most, when people perhaps who you think are in your camp, they say things like, "Hey, Lyle, can you tone down your concern about the gay marriage issue? It's not really that big a deal. There's other issues that we should be fighting." That sort of subtle undermining, which in your gut that's wrong to give into, because you know what's at stake. But there are people on your side who want to curry favour perhaps with the left. They want to de-escalate the culture wars. So they say, look, tone down your rhetoric. You're too fixated on one issue, whether it's abortion or marriage or whatever the particular issue of the time is. Have a more broad-based approach, because they don't understand how serious the battle actually is. So that's probably what hurts the most.
Yeah. And, it's always tone it down, don't mention the war now.
Yeah, exactly.
Shut up, be quiet. And, at the end of the day, you never ever get round to tackling those issues, which are the big issues, particularly abortion. But I want to stay focused on the same-sex marriage plebiscite for a moment. Now, I got to tell you that, and I think I might have relayed this to you in the past, it might shock some listeners to hear my view on this, that actually, if I was to wave the magic wand and deal with the whole issue of marriage, I'd probably ultimately get government right out of it, because what role does government play in regulating relationships, full stop? Unless, of course, it's for a societal reason, such as the regeneration of society through procreation. That's gone by the wayside, to be quite honest, prior to even the same-sex marriage plebiscite and the definition of marriage changing. So my view is pretty libertarian when it comes to that. But what I did foresee in that same-sex marriage plebiscite, it wasn't so much to me the issue of two men wanting to get married or two women wanting to get married. In fact, if I had gotten a guarantee in the question that that's the only thing going to change, maybe I might have thought twice, because, that doesn't offend me. I'm talking about a civil declaration by a government about a registration of a relationship. What was at stake and what clearly has come to pass are all of the things that have gone along with it.
That's right.
Now, you were warning about that. Talk us through some of those concerns and talk us through where we've ended up.
Well, firstly, I hear what you're saying about getting government right out of marriage, and that's where, despite our wonderful friendship, George, I would disagree there. I think there is a role for government, because the law is not just there to beat people over the heads if they step out of line with something. The law has a function as a teacher. It's not just to punish people for doing evil. It does have that function. Of course, you want the law to step in if a murder has been committed or serious crime and the like. But it also has a function to say this is what we as a society culturally value. And marriage, is something which ensures that, children have some sort of legal connection to their mother and father. And of course, that's all been shattered long before gay marriage came along, when we, the sexual revolution, anything goes. And, we accepted the idea that families didn't matter anymore, and a family was anyone who shared a wheelie bin. So, I've said this before, it wasn't gay marriage that destroyed marriage. The heterosexuals had already trashed it for a few decades previously, and then this came along. And I guess this goes to, your question about, well, what are the consequences? And like you, if it was just about two people loving each other and living their own life, and, I probably wouldn't have died in the ditches for it either, notwithstanding what I just said. But the reality is, once you take away the gender diversity requirement in marriage, then, you're on a slippery slope to a whole bunch of other things. And the key changes that we've seen accelerate since the end of 2017, when the plebiscite was lost and the Marriage Act was changed in the Parliament. You were there for that. The rainbow flag was waved on the floor of the Parliament. So free speech, has gone out the window. So I'm currently being stood.
Can I interrupt with just a little vignette? I was there on the floor of Parliament trying to move and vote for amendments to protect religious liberty. A bunch of amendments, and every time those amendments failed, there was cheering from the crowds that were assembled in the galleries. And I actually made the point of saying, I can't believe this. Every time we've got one of these amendments which go towards religious liberty and enshrining religious liberty, a safeguard, every time one of those amendments gets voted down, the gallery's cheering. At the point of me actually saying that, the gallery started cheering. Cheering after I had just exactly articulated what I was worried about, the erosion of religious liberty.
The amendments that have been put forward by the member for Mallee go very much to the heart, again, of religious liberty that we've seen voted down again and again today in this House. And we've seen cheers from the gallery, cheering for the erosion of religious liberty, cheering for the erosion of religious liberty. And there they go, cheering again, when I'm specifically saying eroding of religious liberty. They support that. They support that. That is the voice of tolerance today. And I am disgusted. I am absolutely disgusted that we are going down this track.
So that was a real eye-opener moment for me. I thought, my goodness, they really don't want religious liberty, these guys.
And it wasn't those amendments that you were, courageously speaking to and voting on when so many of your own colleagues in the Liberal Party, national parties, the parties of freedom and supporting the traditional family, those amendments were simply giving effect to everything that the gay marriage campaign said would be protected. So they said no one's freedoms would be affected. Right. No one's religious liberty, no one's freedom of speech. You would still be allowed to say and believe whatever you liked about marriage, even though the land changed. We were concerned that degendering marriage would accelerate the whole safe schools, gender fluid education of children in schools. They laughed at us and said that would never be the case. That was a red herring that had nothing to do with it. Well, within months of the law passing, the Queensland Education Minister, Grace, and I say this in the book, she was asked, why is gender fluid indoctrination being taught in Queensland high schools? And she said, well, we've just had the biggest debate on marriage equality. That was her answer to that question. And yet months earlier, they were saying, no, you, Lyle and George and all those defending marriage by introducing that this was the next tranche of reform coming down the track. We were throwing in red herrings and trying to confuse the debate. We were actually spot on, and you saw it firsthand, the hypocrisy within days on the floor of the Parliament. So we've had a Christian school recently, Ballarat Christian College, sued by what is now the marriage plebiscite campaign. Australian Marriage Equality has morphed into an organisation, a standing full-time campaign organisation called Equality Australia, led by Anna Brown, one of the plebiscite leaders. She engages Clayton Utes, a big city Melbourne law firm, to go after Ballarat Christian College because there's a teacher there who doesn't want to support the schools and the parents' beliefs about marriage anymore because the Marriage Act has changed. And so they have to settle out of court and pay this rogue teacher who doesn't believe the school's view on marriage. They have to pay her money. These are consequences. I debated Tony Abbott's sister, Christine Forster, on Sky News many, many times. And I raised the issue of Christian schools not being free anymore. And she said they would be free. They would not be affected. Yet within months...
To be fair to Christine, I mean, she's probably someone who ultimately believes that they should be free to do what they want. The problem is that, as you've just said there are people at the head of the movement, the people in control of the movement that are driving changes.
she was a spokesperson for the movement. They put her up to debate me almost every week on Sky for weeks on end during the plebiscite. She was, now, I'd love to think what you're thinking and think the best of Christine. And I do think she's a reasonable person. I have a lot of respect for her. But she should have come out and said, I'm really sorry that I said that, because she's effectively been thrown under a bus by the campaign that she fronted, because they have then just gone and done the things that she said on behalf of that campaign would not happen.
You're listening to Conservative One.
Okay, so tell us about some of the other changes that you've seen that have emanated since then. Religious liberty, for instance. We have seen, you've just given an example of it with this Christian school here, but we have seen religious liberty eroded. It was sort of, that process was starting before the marriage plebiscite, but has sped up a fair bit. One key thing to show that religious liberty is not secure in Australia is the case, which again I note is in your book, of Archbishop Julian Porteous in Tasmania, the Catholic Archbishop who sent out a missive to a Catholic school for the parents of Catholic school students who probably would be Catholics mostly, talking about the Catholic Church's teaching on marriage, and for that horrible crime he was brought before or threatened to be brought before the Tasmanian Discrimination Tribunal. The case was ultimately dropped, I think probably because of the negative press as we headed into the campaign around same-sex marriage. But ultimately I noted that the tribunal head, or the departing tribunal head at the time, said that she wished that the complaint would have went through because she believed that there was a case to answer.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Insane stuff. I mean, if you really process that, for articulating a religious belief to people who should be of the same faith within your own sort of church structure, which the schools are, you can fall afoul of anti-discrimination laws. That's accelerated, hasn't it?
It has indeed, and that lies there as a weapon against anyone who dares now dissent from what is now a new law of the land. I mean, the Porteous case, it's iconic, and there are others as well. There's Campbell Markham, also a Presbyterian minister down in Tasmania, subject to similar sort of legal action. I'm currently being sued by a drag queen through the Queensland Human Rights Commission under the 1991 Anti-Discrimination Act. And this is the point, and this might all sound, technical sort of legal mumbo-jumbo to many of your viewers, George, but it's really important, because our whole argument was that if you change the definition of marriage, you will weaponise these state-based anti-discrimination laws that exist in every state and also at a federal level. And that's what Porteous got tripped up on, because he put out his beautiful pastoral letter, Don't Mess with Marriage. I read it. There's nothing bigoted or homophobic. It just simply says the church's teaching is that marriage is between a man and a woman. Children, wherever possible, deserve the love of their mother and father. That's something that is broken through same-sex marriage and same-sex family formation. Doesn't mean gay people can't be good parents. Of course they can. But two blokes can't be a mother and two women can't be a father. And children, for all sorts of emotional and sociological reasons, need the complementary love of both. And that's why the government should be interested in marriage, to create an environment where this is what we encourage. We all know that marriages end because of tragedy and divorce and desertion. No one thinks those are good things, but let's encourage through public policy what we know is good. And that's all that Porteous was saying. And yet he was sued. And this is the point we kept saying over and over again. If you're going to change the marriage law, okay, fine, we don't agree with that, but you must then create a Commonwealth override of state-based anti-discrimination law so that freedom of speech can exist, so that people can say that I believe that marriage is man-woman, without that then triggering some vilification or someone taking offence. I mean, literally the bar is as low as offence in some of these state-based laws. Yeah. And people get offended if you say that I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. Well, that excludes me and you're being bigoted, and therefore I'm going to run a case up through the commission. So that hasn't been protected, George. And unfortunately, your discrimination bill that your Attorney General Christian Porter, and I should say ours, because I'm an aspiring member of the LNP, but it doesn't address that issue, which is one of the biggest issues of the whole marriage campaign, because it's just too hard for the government to handle.
So do you think that a religious discrimination bill or a religious liberty bill is something that is needed? Because I note there are, let me backtrack a bit. Religious freedom and religious liberty to me is the ditch that, politically we need to die in. If we don't have that, we don't have anything. So to me, this is a fundamental issue. Not just because I'm a Christian. This is for people of all faith and people of no faith, because religion is about belief. Belief is about thought. If you don't have freedom of religion, you essentially don't have an aspect of freedom of thought. And that is just terrible. I mean, the fact is that we've got government laws and rules and regulations and tribunals that have taken away or chipped away at that freedom of religion, which is an aspect of freedom of thought and freedom of belief and freedom of choice. So we need to, I think, fix that somehow. The best thing that I heard another one of the Good Source contributors, Reverend James McPherson, say would be not to have new laws, but to get rid of all of the bad laws. I mean, we could only wish. That's probably unlikely to happen. So what do you think is the route that we should take to fix this major problem of the chipping away of religious liberty?
Yeah, well, look, I agree with James, and I was going to say that that would have been my response to your question. We have to, get rid of the state-based anti-discrimination laws. Now, I think there's a reasonable case for discrimination law when it comes to race. But when you have subjective lines, when it comes to gender and sexual orientation and all this sort of stuff, and it can be something as low a bar as causing offence, and then you can go after someone in a legal process. Well, that's just crazy. That is a diminution of not just freedom of religion, and I agree with everything you said about freedom of religion, because that goes to the basis of people's freedom as human creatures. But just under 5 million Australians voted no on that plebiscite. This is an issue of freedom of speech for them, and these laws affect them. So I think you've got to, at least, if you can't abolish or severely defang the state-based anti-discrimination laws, then you've got to have some sort of a Commonwealth override of them. Now, I floated that during the plebiscite, and mate, all hell broke loose. They said that I wanted laws to enable bigotry. This is how they framed the conversation. And I think, in part because of that dynamic, the Rudder Commission swift it. Yeah.
I'll double down on that. I mean, George Brandis got in trouble for saying people have the right to be a bigot.
Well, Mr. President, people do have a right to be bigots,
Let me actually say, he's right. People do have the right to be bigoted if they want to be. That's about thought. I mean, it's not a great thing to be a bigot, but if you want to be a bigot, that's your right. That is thought.
But in a free society, you call that out, and you have that debate in the public square. You don't need to then have this litigious culture where anyone who's offended by your bigotry can take you off to court. But George, I'm perplexed as to why Christian Porter's process in the wake of the Ruddock Commission into Religious Freedom, which ran for over a year, achieved virtually very little, and missed the big issue when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and that is the weaponisation of state-based anti-discrimination law. That whole process and the draft bill that Christian Porter has, which I now understand is probably not going to see the light of day until after the election, if at all. The can has been kicked down the road because of COVID and the like, and it's just too hot for the government to handle. That bill does nothing to protect free speech, does nothing to stop another Julius Porter's case. To me, it's a waste of time.
I think there's some moves, to be fair. There were some moves in the second draft of that religious discrimination bill to try and tidy that up. I got to say that without telling the public of how the sausage is made, that I have had a fair bit to do with trying to get in a Julian Porteous protection clause into that bill. So we'll see when it does pop out the other end, and hopefully it's a perfect looking.
Well, my observations these days are as someone who's sitting well outside the process, so that heartens me to hear that, George. So thank you. That's good on you.
So you in chapter 14, I'm not sure whether this is a self-referential title or not, but chapter 14 is titled, in your book, of course, this one, I kid you not. Chapter 14 is titled Successful Failure. I got to say, I sort of know what you're getting at when you say successful failure, because sometimes looking back on even all of the fights and all of the things that I've been involved in, I go, boy, it's a lot of losses there. Yeah. It feels good at the time, but I mean, you sort of begin to wonder after a while. Is that self-referential, Lyle? What do you mean by successful failure?
Look, the book is a chronicle of failure. I think there's only 2 campaigns in the entire book over 20 years that were successful. One was the Toowoomba water debate about drinking recycled sewage. That was a plebiscite that I fought. Malcolm Turnbull was involved in it. I was involved on the winning side against Malcolm Turnbull in that one, and then we faced off 10 years later in the marriage debate. And then the other success was a campaign that you and I were involved in around changes to what was allowed in strip clubs, the most obscene things, and I won't repeat it here. You can read the book. So those 2 campaigns were successful. The rest was a failure. Successful failure, that chapter specifically relates to the 18 months I spent with Corey Bernardi's fledgling Australian Conservatives. I guess, tens of thousands of Australians flocked to his party when he left the Liberal Party. And as he would say, he would feel that he didn't leave the Liberal Party left him. And he stood up for principles of smaller government, obviously, the family and social policy issues, a decent energy policy that wasn't beholden to climate cult ideology, a whole range of things which were very attractive to mainstream Australians like myself. And I'd just come off the back of the marriage campaign, and I just, yourself obviously accepted, George, and I have enormous respect for you and a handful of your colleagues who do sweat blood and put your head above the parapet and pay an enormous price that people don't know about. But I also saw, sadly, guys like you are few and far between. I just saw so many good people in the parliament capitulating and just not having the strength to meet the challenge that was coming from the aggressive left. And so I joined Corey's party, came back up to Queensland, my home state, and organised the party here, ran for the Senate, and we lost spectacularly. Now, ScoMo, rode in and, dispatched with Turnbull, which was a big, reason why many of us joined the Conservatives. So that really, cut our grass, but by then we'd come too far to stop. And look, I think, the LNP will probably disagree with this, although many of its grassroots won't. But I think we helped, nudge the party back more to the centre-right from its drift to the extreme left. And ScoMo certainly pivoted more in that direction, and people flocked back to him at the election, and he won the miracle election. And I tell you, George, no one was more thrilled about that result than Australian Conservative supporters, even though we did so dismally that the Marijuana Party and the Animal Rights Parties beat us for votes. But we knew that we'd made a contribution to helping, get the Conservative side of politics back on track to some degree. So I guess that's what we refer to there. So
you've experienced all of these losses that you talk about in your book over some critical issues, and some of them that I really do feel very sad over. I mean, deeply depressed over some of them, like the abortion debate and the trajectory that that laws regarding abortion have in this country. Where do you think we are heading? I mean, because I've had discussions with you in the past where I'm very, very pessimistic about the state of affairs and where we might be going as a nation and as a civilization. You seem to have hope despite this sort of successful failure. You know, what you've quoted there about past campaigns, and where do you think we're going, Lyle?
I think we are on a downward trajectory. That's just the objective reality of where we are. But I, like you, George, I take hope in Christ, and I also look at history and what I see as the hand of providence, the hand of God in history, and it shows us that it's cyclical. I'm still, you know, I can still remember when Soviet communism was invincible, and yet that came crashing down. No one thought it would. I think the edifice that the cultural left has constructed in our societies is just as rotten as that. And I think it just takes a few brave people, as it did for communism. You had Reagan in your wonderful, inspiring intro, and Thatcher. You know, Reagan, Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II, they just determined, in the face of the lies, again, of the left, which many parts of academia in the West were apologists for Soviet communism, despite the evidence of its bloody history. And so Thatcher, Reagan, Pope John Paul II just determined to keep speaking truth to culture. And I think I have a firm conviction that average Australians, whether they are people of faith like you and I or just ordinary people, if they get to hear the truth, they will go, what the heck is that about? I mean, I don't think the average Australian supports the killing of babies in the womb, particularly at the late term stage. And yet that's the laws that have been rammed through our parliament. And they're not debated properly, and the media gives the left a leave pass all the time. So the issues are never properly ventilated. So the average Australian doesn't see them. And then people like you and I are just vilified and demonised as hard right. You know, some pejorative is put in front of our name. We're controversial. So people don't even take a look at our arguments, and it's all designed to shut down the debate. I'm optimistic because I think if enough of us can keep putting the truth out there, and if Australians can hear it through the filter, and that's why podcasts like this are so important, and books like I've just written, which expose what goes on behind the scenes, I think that can help create a movement that will see what is, in my view, a rotten fence. Just having a whole bunch of people who suddenly have their eyes open to the truth push on that rotten fence, and suddenly it falls over like the Berlin Wall does. So I'm optimistic, but I'm under no illusions about how difficult it is for those of us who are in the trenches.
I think that in your book, the quote that you open up with from Cardinal Francis George is quite poignant for what we're talking about and where we're heading. I expect to die in bed. My successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. His successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history. I think that pretty much sums it up. Thanks very much, Lyle.
Pleasure, George. Thanks for having me.
Is there something else you wanted to say there before we go?
Just to pay homage to the man who wrote the foreword, and Jim Wallace, who was my great mentor at Australian Christian Lobby, a great Australian who served in the SAS and commanded our Army's Mechanised Brigade.
Great guy.
He opened that quote from Cardinal George is what he chose for the start of the foreword that he wrote for the book, and it was a great privilege for me to have my friend and mentor write that foreword and open up with that quote. I joke with Jim that the foreword is the most coherent piece of writing in the whole book, but if people buy it, just buy it for Jim's foreword.
I'm sure it's not. In fact, I've bumped into people that have asked me to pick up copies when I see you next week. So I understand that it's gone into a second print as well. Yes, George, we're just about to. The first print of 1,000 copies is almost gone, and so I'll be busy this weekend just correcting a few spelling mistakes and grammatical errors. So the second print run will hopefully be out shortly. So that's encouraging. I'm really blown away by the feedback and the support for the book. And look, before I do the proper wrap up, I had a false start there before, but before we do the proper wrap up, where can people go to find your book? You can get it from my website, lyleshelton.com.au. Yep, and it's published by Connor Court. How much is it retailing for?
Connor Court, yes, great conservative publishers, and it retails for $30, but with $5 for postage and handling. So $35 if you buy it off the website.
Okay, fantastic. LyleShelton.com.au. Thanks very much for joining us, Lyle Shelton.
Thanks very much, George. God bless you.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
You've been listening to the Conservative One podcast with George Christensen.